everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Allison, and I am an adult services librarian at the Hudson Library, and I wanted to thank all of you so much for joining us for tonight's cooking demonstration. Before we get started, I want to remind you to keep checking our website for new virtual programs. Later this week, on Thursday the 11th, we have author Janice Namura speaking on her book, The Doctor's Blackwell. And next week, on Monday, February 15th, we have author Marco Tedesco speaking on his book, The Hidden Life of Ice. You can sign up for these programs, as well as any others, directly on our website at hudsonlibrary.org. Tonight, I am happy to introduce Stefanie Paganini, who is the Executive Director and Instructor at the International Culinary Arts and Sciences Institute in Chesterland, Ohio. Continuing with February's Taste of Italy programming, she'll be demonstrating how to make Budino, which is chocolate pudding, and biscotti. We love for these cooking programs to be interactive, so if you have any questions for Stefanie during the program, please send them in using the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will relay the questions along to her. Also, if you're looking for the recipe for tonight, it's included in the email that you received with your Zoom link. I will go ahead and send that out again after the program as well. If Stefanie's ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Good evening. Thank you, Allison. I'm excited to be here with all of you. I know that Italy is one of those places that we all wish we could be right now. And hopefully soon, when things get safer, we'll be able to go back there sometime soon. So before we can, while we're still being safe at home, it's lovely to be able to share with you some of my heritage. I'm from Italy. My mom, Loretta Paganini, who started the Paganini School of Cooking over 30 years ago, is actually from a town in Italy called Bologna, Italy. And that is in the Emilia-Romagna region, which is the valley, and is known for food. It's called La Città Grossa, or the fat city. So when Italians want to go someplace for really good food, they go to Bologna. They go to that city. So some of the dishes that I'm going to talk to you about tonight are from that area, using ingredients from that area. But certainly all regions of Italy are amazing and have amazing food. So to get started, we're going to do with Bologna's version of a very specific cookie that we know in Italy called the biscotti. Now, biscotti is certainly a national cookie in Italy. In, let's say, Tuscany or that region, they call it cantucci. So it has variations of it depending on which region you're from. So the version that I'm making is from my mom's hometown of Bologna. So let's get started. I'm a pastry chef here at Akazi. So I tend to get very technical about my baking. So I might talk to you using some professional terminology, but don't worry, you don't need to know all of that stuff to do it, but I think it's interesting, so I'll share that with you as well. So to get started, we're going to be making a cookie. And I'm sure all of you have made cookies at home, chocolate chip, snickerdoodles, my husband's favorite peanut butter cookies. And maybe when you cook at home, you start with butter that's room temperature, softened, and sugar, and you blend those together in a mixing method called the creaming method. When you make biscotti, true biscotti does not have any butter in it. So if you find a biscotti recipe online and it has butter, it's not from Bologna, because true Bologna biscotti, no butter. So in order to get that creaming method without butter, you're going to use a mixing method called the sponge method. And that's really just eggs and sugar blended together in your food processor. So I'm going to take my sugar. I have about 2 cups of sugar and 4 large eggs. And I'm going to mix those together in my food processor, just like you would if you were making a chocolate chip cookie with your butter and your sugar. And I'm going to let those run together for a little bit of time, 1 to 2 minutes, just so that they really blend. What's happening in my cookie is the sugar is breaking that egg down, causing little tears in it, micro tears, that are then trapping air in that egg. This allows this to volumize and give me a nice sort of crumbly texture on the inside of my biscotti. So while that's mixing, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the other ingredients that we have. We did some zesting. So right before we went live, I zested a lemon, a whole lemon, and a whole orange. Taking my microplane, I just ran it gently across the top of my piece of fruit. What I'm really going for is that top skin, that dark color on that fruit. One layer down, that whitish kind of area, that's called the pith, and it's very bitter. We don't want that in our recipe. It's going to bring a bitter flavor to our cookie. The top coating, though, that top colored part of the fruit, has a high concentration of oils. So if you're a fan of essential oils, you know the power of smell and taste an oil has. And so the fruit has that oil in that top skin layer. And that's why we like the zest in a food. It's going to bring a maximum intensity of flavor. So 1 orange and 1 lemon I've zested while I'm waiting for my sugar and my eggs to mix. Next going in here, it's going to be a little vanilla extract.
Stefanie?
Yeah.
Are the eggs at room temperature?
They are. Ideally, when you're baking, you want your eggs and really most of your ingredients to be at room temperature. If you're pulling your egg out of the refrigerator and you're wondering, how do I get an egg at room temperature before I've had the opportunity to get everything done? I don't want my egg sitting out for hours. If you take just like a small bowl and fill it with warm water from the tap, so not boiling, and put your egg in the shell, the whole shell, in that warm water while you measure all the rest of your ingredients. By the time you're ready to do your recipe, those eggs should be to room temperature very quickly for you. Good question. All right, so next going into my KitchenAid, I'm going to add my zest. So that beautiful orange and lemon zest is going in. And the order of these ingredients don't matter as much. The first 2, very important. The last ingredient to go in, very important on its order. The rest of these in the middle, you can interchange them on whim.
Another quick question for you. How do you clean the lemon so that it is safe to zest?
How do you keep the what?
How do you clean the lemon so that it is safe to zest?
So you can buy a fruit cleaner if you like. A lot of the fruits, they come with a natural wax on them as they're being processed through after they've been harvested. They've put a wax on them to preserve them. So a lot of times what you can do is you can buy like a fruit cleaner. What I do is I have a spray bottle at home. I put a little bit of white vinegar in there, like 1 part of white vinegar to 4 or 5 parts of water. And I just spray my fruit and then soak them in water afterward. And that just removes that wax when I'm ready to use it, pat it dry, and then I can zest it up. Good question. Okay, so from here, I'm going to add some baking powder to my flour so that when it's time for me to mix my flour in, my baking powder is ready to go. Same thing with my salt, putting it in with my flour. And the next thing that's going to make this machine get really loud are my mix-ins. So for tonight's biscotti, I'm using dried cranberry and slivered almond. But if you want, you could use dried cherries, dried apricots. You could use pecans, pistachios. You can get rid of the nut altogether. If you have a nut allergy, you could add chocolate chips. You can interchange any of these mixed-in ingredients. Just keep the volume of them the same. So in my mixer is going my almonds. And I'm going to add my dried cranberries. But before I got my dried cranberries ready for my mixer, I soaked them in a little bit of orange juice. This allows my dried cranberries to soften a little bit. When you cook dried fruit, they only get drier. So by soaking them in a little bit of moisture, it allows them to plump up and get some flavor in there as well. I went with orange juice to kind of match the orange flavor in my zest, but you could do anything. You could do dried cherries in amaretto or a different liqueur if you want to add another layer of flavor to your cookie. So I've strained that juice out. So I have my dried cherries that have been soaking in the liquid, but I've strained the liquid out, and I'm going to add that fruit now into my mixer.
Which attachment are you using on your KitchenAid?
A paddle attachment. The reason we're using the paddle attachment is because the whisk attachment would be too much air. The whisk is made to put air into this. The paddle will mix it with a small amount of air, but not too much air. So good question, paddle attachment. And then, gang, I like to sift my flour, which I did already, and then I put it in a little sheet of parchment paper. This allows me to add my flour to my mixer without it going all over the countertop. So those are famous last words. Let's see what happens. So slowly adding my flour and allowing it to incorporate in.
Do you use a special type of flour?
No, this is all-purpose flour. Just a simple all-purpose flour. That's what the recipe was made to be used with. So it's great, whatever you have at home. At home, I use King Arthur. It's one that I really like. But really, any all-purpose flour that you use at home is perfect for this recipe. I want to show you this dough. First of all, it smells amazing in here. But I want to show you how kind of thick this dough is. So I have a really nice thick dough. I put gloves here to remind me to put them on. You certainly don't have to wear gloves at home, but because I'm touching a raw egg product and I don't want to stop to wash my hands in the sink, I'm going to put gloves on for this portion. In front of me, I have a sheet tray with, whoops, that's a fire alarm here at the school. I'm going to assume that the other chefs in the other classrooms are going to take care of that.
While we're waiting on that, I have a couple questions to go back on. First, we have someone asking, is there a certain amount of time that the cranberries or other fruit should soak before draining and adding them?
15 minutes is more than enough time. So what I like to do is I like to get my eggs out of the refrigerator first, since it's easy to pull 4 eggs out of the refrigerator, and I'll put them in the warm water. And then the second thing I'll measure out is the cranberries and put them in the juice. And then by the time I've measured all my other ingredients out and gotten them ready at the counter, the cranberries are ready to go in. All right. So don't worry, there's not a fire here at the school. Anytime you have students doing a cooking, sometimes they smoke or burn things, and it sets off the fire alarm. What's nice is the fire department knows us very well, and we often feed them when they come to visit us for false alarm. All right, so I'm taking my dough, and I'm basically turning it into like a little log or sausage right here on my cookie sheet. I want my biscotti dough to be skinny and tall as I lay it down on the sheet pan. The reason for that is that this recipe has a lot of sugar in it, and sugar inhibits the gluten structure. So this is going to spread a little bit while it's baking. I'm going to prevent that spread or work with that spread, kind of anticipate it by doing 2 things. One, making sure when I put this dough down to make my biscotti, I have it in a log form that's skinny and tall. So as it spreads, it'll give a more traditional biscotti shape to it. And secondly, I'm going to start my oven at a higher temperature so that my biscotti hardens quickly so that it doesn't spread too much as it's baking. So I've got 1 log. I'm going to do the second log. This recipe makes 2 logs or 3 smaller ones. I love that because I might slice and serve one up. And the second one, after it bakes, I'm going to freeze it and keep it in the freezer for when company comes over and I need a quick something, or gosh, I'm going to a party and it's a bring something, of course, pre-COVID, but then you have something to bring with you without a lot of work on your part.
We have a couple people wondering if you could substitute the flour for almond flour.
So almond flour or a flour alternative won't substitute well 1-for-1 in this recipe, because when you replace the gluten in a wheat flour, like all-purpose flour, you're losing something that's going to hold on to moisture. And almond flour on its own won't do that for you. A great alternative is they make so many wonderful gluten-free flour alternatives out there. My favorite is one by Thomas Keller called 1-for-1. King Arthur makes a nice one as well. Use their all-purpose gluten-free flour. That works really nicely in this recipe. But what they do is they add other ingredients into that flour mix. It's often a rice flour mix, but they add other ingredients in there that mimic the moisture retention you get from the protein in gluten. And so they might add xanthan gum to give you that kind of moisture mouthfeel. So you don't want to just replace it with almond flour, but maybe some kind of a gluten-free blend that uses almond flour would be okay. All right, so from here, I want to show you that this recipe is a little bit kind of sticky here, and it's not quite what I'm looking for as far as a smooth surface. So when my biscotti bakes, if it doesn't have a smooth surface when it goes in the oven, it's not going to magically smooth out like maybe a chocolate chip cookie would. So I'm going to dip my fingers in that residual juice, that orange juice, and I'm just going to, with damp fingers, kind of press them onto my dough to smooth my biscotti out. It's going to add a little flavor on the outside, a little crunch. That moisture is going to make a crunchier outside for me. And it's going to make sure my biscotti has a nice look to it when it bakes. All right. So this is my biscotti going into the oven. Now, some of you may or may not know, but I am on Fox 8 News in the morning once a month, usually the first Wednesday of the month. So I'm pretty good with TV magic. So this is going into the oven. And look at that. I didn't even need an oven to do oven magic. Here's what it looks like when it comes out. So our biscotti, you see it here, it looks almost like a French bread, doesn't it? It's got a wonderful brown bottom to it. It's got a wonderful color to it. It cracked a little in the baking, which is okay. I'm going to take this and I'm going to slice this up. So biscotti is called biscotti because it's actually a twice baked cookie. Biscotti in Italian means twice cooked. Bi, like a bicycle, bi, means two or twice. And cotti in Italian means to cook. So biscotti cookies are actually twice baked or twice cooked. When I go to chop this, I'm going to use my knife of choice. You can use a chef's knife, which has the rounded edge on the bottom. This is the classic sort of French trained knife. Or you can use a Japanese style that has the flat end on it, whatever is most comfortable knife for you. And then I like to cut these a little bit on an angle because it makes it look like it's a longer cookie. And depending how thick you cut your slices, you can get 12 to 24 pieces out of one log.
Do you wait for this to totally cool before you cut it, or just when it's a little bit cool?
You want it totally cool. If you wait till it's still warm or even slightly warm, then what happens is the knife drags across it and it gets kind of rough in the center. Often when you bake your biscotti for the first bake, the center is still very soft. Sometimes it might even be a little gummy. And you don't want that. You want that center to be cooked. So what we do is we second bake it. We take our cookies. And you can see I lay them on the cookie sheet. They're not going to spread or do anything more than just sort of dry out. So I'm going to take those cookies, dry them out by putting them back in the oven for however long I want. So if I want them to still be somewhat soft in the center, which is how I like my biscotti, less than 5 minutes, maybe 5 minutes max. If I want them really dried out where you have to dunk them to eat them, then maybe you're going to go 7 to 10 minutes on this second bake. But it's a wonderful gift to give people. It's a wonderful thing to have around to snack. And again, you can mix into these. Mine have cranberries and almonds on the inside of them, but you can certainly put chocolate chips or cherries, like I said, whatever maybe you have in your pantry that you want to use in your cookies. Any questions about the biscotti? I'm going to take questions now while I set up for our second recipe.
We have a couple here. Though we're going back just a little bit on your actions here, but what speed did you mix the eggs and sugar on?
So the eggs and sugar were on, in this KitchenAid, it was about a 4, which is low. It's like one snatch up from the lowest setting. So it's 1 up from the lowest setting. So a low to low medium is what I used.
Okay. And then I think the question is in reference to the parchment paper that you put on the tray to bake the biscotti. Is it necessary to use parchment paper underneath it while it bakes?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm obsessed with parchment paper, so my answer to you is going to be yes. Here's why. Parchment paper, you guys, the fire department is here. I'm watching the firemen walk through our lobby. So parchment paper is great for you because in a biscotti, again, we don't want it to spread. So as the cookie bakes, we're going to have it, it's going to catch onto that parchment paper, and it's not going to spread as easily as if you take a pan and spray it with cooking spray or butter it down. Or even a Silpat will allow it to spread a little too much. So you could do a dry pan, no spray, no fat or anything, but then you're going to have to struggle to kind of pull that cookie off that tray. So parchment paper really is the perfect answer to making biscotti. So I'm going to say yes, because it makes your life easier. And nowadays, you know, I like to talk about in the olden days when I was super old, we used to have to get parchment paper in rolls, and we had to take the rolls of parchment paper. But nowadays, you can actually buy the parchment paper, fold it up, and in squares that fit your cookie sheet. So I love those. That's what I use at home. So I'm going to say yes to parchment paper.
All right, how would you add chocolate topping, or have you ever added a glaze?
So if you want to make your biscotti fancy, and a lot of times people like to do that, they'll take their biscotti and they will dip them in chocolate. You'll want to get a nice chocolate that is either tempered, or you can buy something called coating chocolate, which is the butter in the recipe, the fat, the sugar fat, cocoa butter that's in there is removed and replaced with sort of like a vegetable shortening so that it doesn't need to temper. You would warm that up so it's melted, and then you could either dip part of your cookie and then put it on a tray to cool, or take that chocolate maybe in a spoon or in a piping bag and just drizzle it over your biscotti and let that cool. And then you have that beautiful chocolate topping or coating or portion that's dipped in chocolate to make it fancier.
All right, do you want more questions now, or do you want me to save some of these for the end?
You're welcome to give me a couple more. I'm happy to take them.
All right, let's see. How would you adapt the recipe with mix-ins that are savory, like bits of cheese and herbs?
So, great question. I do a wonderful biscotti that is sesame flavored. It's got some sesame seeds in there, a little sesame oil, and some herbs to it. You're going to back down on the sugar for sure, because the sugar is going to bring some sweetness to the recipe. You can't get rid of the sugar entirely, because the sugar is going to add in the ratio of your cookie, it's breaking down that gluten structure. And without that sugar, your biscotti will quickly turn into bread, into a breadstick versus a cookie. So you might want to cut the sugar in half though. You could add an additional egg to help with the emulsion or the breaking down of that gluten. And then you can add your savory ingredients to that.
Perfect. And just a reminder, I'm seeing a couple questions about baking temps and the recipe and questions along those lines. The recipe is included in the email that you got with your Zoom link, and I will go ahead and send that out again after the program if you can't find it from the first time. But another question, two questions that kind of go along. This says, do you bake the second time as the same temp as the first time? And also, why are you baking at a higher temperature than what you would normally bake most recipes at?
Again, we want that biscotti outside to crust up before it spreads. And so that's why we're baking at a higher temperature than a traditional cookie might. In your second bake, it's up to you if you want that higher temperature or not. I know you're like, oh, she sounds like an Italian grandmother, right? Like, oh, you bake it for this long until you want it to. But here's why. You're the chef when you bake at home. And so what outcome you want from your biscotti is what temperature you're going to want to bake it at. So again, I like my biscotti soft in the center. So I might have it at a high temperature for my second bake so that the outside gets a little crunchy, but the inside stays very soft. Or if I want the whole thing dried out all the way to the center so it's very hard and I can dip it in coffee and feel comfortable with it not falling apart, and I want that kind of experience of that really kind of break your teeth crunch, then maybe I'm going to drop my oven temperature and not cook it high and cook it maybe at 350 or even lower, because I want to give the center time to dry out before the outside gets brown. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect. I guess maybe one more here and then we'll let you get to the next thing.
Okay, great.
Okay, so how long do the biscotti keep, and what's the best way to store them?
So biscotti, because it's an awfully dry cookie. In fact, the way that biscotti was sort of invented was because it dries out. It doesn't mold very quickly. There's very little moisture left over after the second bake. And so it travels really well. So you can keep a biscotti in an airtight container for about 2 weeks before you're worrying about it kind of going bad on you or staling out. That's if you want to keep it room temperature or in the refrigerator. As long as it's airtight, you're pretty safe for up to 2 weeks with that. If you want to keep it beyond that, or you want to keep it at really peak flavor profile, then I recommend freezing it. Biscotti Frozen is ideal. I throw it in like a little Tupperware container. I close the top. I throw it in the freezer. Make sure that it's dry before you do that. It's not warm, that it's cooled completely down. And then you can keep it for up to 3 months in your freezer. And then what I do, I take a piece out here and there for me if I'm keeping it at home. Or like I said, you can keep it fully logged. You can thaw it in your refrigerator, slice it, and bake your second bake after you've thawed the log. And then it's as if you just baked it that day. It has that wonderful, fresh, just baked flavor to it. So depending if you want to pull one out from every once in a while because you're watching, I don't know, macros or something, then you want to slice it and freeze it. Or you can freeze it as the whole log after the first bake and then slice the whole thing up, bake it to dry it up that second time, and serve the whole log that way. All right, we ready to go on?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I have a story to tell you guys. When I was younger, I was allergic to chocolate. So I know I can't hear you all, but I know you all are like making these noises like, oh, poor Stefanie, how did you live? First world problems, right? But I was devastated. All I ate as a child was white chocolate because that's all I could do. Anything that had any kind of cocoa powder in it, and I was having an allergic reaction to it. So every few years I would try chocolate, no go, until I turned 15 and suddenly it went away. And then I have been making up for lost time on chocolate for the rest of my life. So I am passionate about chocolate and the difference in the different chocolates. So I thought if you'll indulge me, I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about how chocolate comes to be. And then we're going to make a recipe with our chocolate. Does that sound good? All right, so here we go. We're going to start by talking about where does chocolate come from. And it comes from originally South America, around the rainforest, so in a hot region that's very wet, very dense rainforest, there lives naturally the cacao tree. And the cacao trees grow these wonderful cocoa pods or cacao pods. And I actually have a couple here. And I'm going to come up close so that you guys can actually see these up close. Doo-doo-doo. So this is a cacao pod. It's pretty ugly. It looks like a big raisin. It's hard. And this is what the inside of it looks like. Now, when these came to maturity, they would fall from the tree. Inside would be the beans, and they would be completely coated in a white goo. And so they would fall to the ground, they would break open, and in the white goo would be little seeds. This is what it looks like sealed, and you can kind of hear the dried out beans inside this one. So this would fall to the ground, it would crack open, it would look like this, and spilling out of it would be a white thick goo that would have these inside it, which are the beans, the cacao or cocoa beans. They would naturally ferment on the floor of the rainforest, covered with all of those leaves and that moisture. And someday, someone, we don't know who, but someone, some brave or very, very crazy person, saw these things fermenting in this white goo on the floor of the rainforest and thought they would try it and see what it tasted like. It was very bitter, but it gave them tons of energy. So they believed these were magic beans that gave them energy. And so they started cultivating these beans. They would take the pods, they would pull them off, they would ferment them naturally by covering them in the wet leaves, and then they would lay them out on the sun, on the ground, and allow the sun to dry them out. They would take these and they would grind them up. Again, they were very bitter, so they would mix them with other natural ingredients they had around the rainforest, like vanilla and honey, and they would turn these into a drink that they called chocolado. And chocolatl was a very prized drink. And so these beans actually became a commodity. You could trade things for beans. Maybe 20 beans would get you a goat. 5 beans would get you a chicken. So they became such a strong commodity that some people in South America actually started growing them, and they would have orchards of cacao trees. So when the Spaniards came to, conquer South America and look for things of value, what they were served was this drink, this chocolatl. And they took that drink back to Spain with them, and that drink became very popular. The Spanish princess got married off to the King of France. She brought with her the chocolatl drink. The chocolatl drink became very popular in the courts of France, and it was the French chefs that started removing the dried up round cacao beans and using them with other ingredients. So that's where chocolate sort of evolved from. When you have these beans nowadays, these beans get fermented and dried, and then they're shipped in big bags to various chocolate manufacturers. And the chocolate manufacturers produce chocolate from these beans. What they do is they take the beans into a big sort of centrifuge, and that allows the beans to crack. And what's inside is a nut. And the inside of the cacao bean looks like this. I don't know if you guys can see these up close, but these are little nibs. Nibs are super popular right now in the pastry world. We like to use those as decorative elements, or we'll mix them in a chocolate bar, but this is sort of your raw cacao. It's very bitter. It tastes a lot like cocoa powder with sort of a creamy, waxy element to it, and that's the cocoa butter that's in there. So you're going to take those cacao beans, those centers of cacao beans called the cocoa nibs, and if you grind those up, 2 things come off of that nib. Cocoa liquor, which cocoa liqueur or cocoa liquor, it's not really liquor. It's actually cocoa powder. And the other thing that comes off of it is cocoa butter. If you take cocoa butter and you mix it with milk and sugar, what you end up with is white chocolate. So white chocolate does come from the cacao plant. It just is the removal of all cocoa liquor. It's only the cocoa butter from the cacao plant that's used in white chocolate. So I was able to realize that what I was allergic to wasn't chocolate, but it was actually the cocoa powder or the cocoa liqueur that's naturally found in all chocolates other than white chocolate. What happens? You keep adding more ingredients to it, and you end up with your different types of chocolate. So milk chocolate uses that cocoa liqueur, but only about 30 to 40% of the recipe is cocoa liqueur. Most of this is milk sugar, milk fats, and some cocoa butter put in there as well. The more cocoa liqueur you have in a recipe, the darker and more bitter that chocolate is. So next step up is semi-sweet. Semi-sweet lives in the 50 to 60 range of cocoa liqueur. And we all know semi-sweet, that's what our chocolate chips we use for chocolate chip cookies are made out of. So semi-sweet is a good sort of Goldilocks chocolate. It's not too sweet, it's not too bitter, it's got some nice flavors to it. And my favorite, especially as a pastry chef, bittersweet, lives in the 70s, 80s, and even up into the low 90s is your bittersweet chocolate. A lot of cocoa liqueur in here means that there's very little room for milk fats or cocoa butters or other ingredients that's going to give it a creamier taste and a sweeter taste. So bitter chocolate is known to be very healthy because the cocoa liqueur is sort of that healthiest part of that cocoa bean. So depending what flavor you like is maybe what you use when you're making a cookie, but when you're baking, it makes a difference because the amount of milk fat or sugar or cocoa butter in a recipe will affect the ratio of your overall recipe. That's why when you see chocolate, couverture chocolate or high-end chocolate, they often not only tell you it's semi-sweet, but they'll tell you what percentage of cocoa liqueur is in that particular company's chocolate recipe. All right, so that's my little chocolate lesson for you. If you ever go on Jeopardy and that's one of the questions, just throw me a couple dollars. All right, so here we go. Let's make something using that chocolate. I'm going to be using some bittersweet chocolate tonight for my Budino. Budino is something that my grandmother in Italy would serve me as a child, and I felt very, very special when she'd make it for me. So we're going to start by making it. If you've ever made a pastry cream, you've made Budino, because Budino is sort of like a chocolate pudding or a chocolate pastry cream. So we're going to start with egg yolks. We don't want any whites because the whites are going to curdle our recipe or make it harder to make a nice, smooth, dense chocolate pudding. So just the yolks in my bowl. To that, I'm going to add some sugar. I'm going to add a little salt, cornstarch, and when we're dealing with a stirred custard, which this is, the cornstarch allows us to mix this at a higher temperature than eggs normally would allow us to mix it. So an egg white will start curdling at 145, an egg yolk a little bit higher than that. So we have egg yolks in here, so we can go up to 150, which is what we want to make sure that we are killing any potential salmonella in our egg. But the cornstarch, what it does is it goes in, when it heats up, it releases its molecules, and it prevents the egg proteins from sticking to each other and sort of scrambling on us. So we love having that cornstarch in our recipe because it's going to allow us to take this to a much warmer temperature than you normally would be able to. So again, in my bowl, egg yolks, sugar, I've added a little bit of salt, and of course my cornstarch in here as my thickener, my starch, to help prevent curdling or the scrambling of our eggs. Now, I want to make this a fancy version. So I'm using a little bit of vanilla and a little bit of a syrup called amarena. Has anyone heard of amarena? Amarena cherries come from the Emilia-Romagna region. Fabri is the name of the family that first started selling amarena cherries. It is a sour cherry found in that region of Italy. Again, the region of Italy my family is from. And they took the sour cherry and then they extracted the juices from the sour cherry, mixed it with sugar, and then put it together to preserve it. So it's a preserved cherry in a wonderful sweet liquor. And this is sort of, I'm going to bring it close. You guys have to see these cherries. Think about a maraschino cherry. And what color is a maraschino cherry? Usually that bright sort of candy red, right? But this cherry and this cherry's sister, the Luxardo cherry, which comes from the Veneto region, these two cherries are very similar in that they're a sour cherry that's been sweetened and preserved in a syrup. But what happened is in the United States during Prohibition, they wanted to remove this cherry because often it preserved a little bit of alcohol back in the day. And so what they did is they would take a sour cherry, and in the United States, the variety they used, I think, was called Queen Anne's. They would bleach the cherry, and then they would add red food dye and corn syrup to make it sweet and look red again. And that's the maraschino cherries that we get today in jars. It's a bleached cherry that's been turned red artificially. So if you're looking for a maraschino cherry that's going to blow your socks off, try an amarena cherry. You can find them, certainly they sell them online. You can find them in Italian import stores. But they come in this really pretty white ceramic glass jar with like blue sort of flowers on it. But they're kind of amazing. So I took the syrup from these cherries and I've added it to the egg and sugar mixture. You don't have to do that. The recipe I provided to you doesn't include those. It's just a standard Budino. But if you want to add the cherry syrup, 1 or 2 teaspoons, a tablespoon in here when you're mixing your egg mixture is perfectly fine. So from there, I'm going to take some milk and cream that I've warmed up on the stove, and I'm going to temper that into my egg mixture. So little by little, slowly I'm adding this cream to my eggs. Again, I don't want to put all the cream in. I don't want to get it too hot. If I make it too hot, it'll take my eggs above the temperature I can heat them to. So by doing it nice and slowly, I'm going to slowly temper or warm my eggs so that they are suspended in a liquid, which then allows me to put them back on the stove and heat them until they thicken. So I'm going to take this over to my stove. I'm going to pour this in here. And while I'm stirring it, while it's warm, I'm going to add my bittersweet chocolate to it. I'm going to mix that all together. And this is sort of the long, kind of boring part. You can't ever stop mixing. If you stop mixing, the eggs will find each other. They will cling to each other, and they will scramble on you. Once the eggs have scrambled, there is nothing you can do about your Budino. You must throw it out. Dogs will not even eat it. I have tried. It is so gross. No one wants sweetened scrambled eggs. So you have to kind of be vigilant, always stirring it. One of the things that I like to use when I stir it is this wonderful tool. Of course, I'm not stirring it and it's going to scramble, right? I don't know if you can see this. This is a soft whisk or a flat whisk. I love this tool. It's great for mixing a pastry cream or a bechamel sauce because it allows you to have lots of breaking points where you're breaking up that product, keeping it mixed. But because it's not a balloon whisk, it's not adding too much air. So you don't have to kind of try and see what you're mixing over the foam that you're creating from like a balloon whisk. So a flat whisk is a great tool to use when whisking this. And you want to get all the way in the corners and mix it all the way around. My grandmother in Italy was a pastry chef. And I was very lucky as a child. We would spend our summers in Italy. And so I loved going and working with her in her bakery when I was a little kid. I'd like to tell you it was because I wanted to learn how to bake, but really it was because she gave me all the free whipped cream I could eat. So that was a motivator for me. But so I'd be in the kitchen with her, and when she would make her pastry creams or the Budino that she would make for me, she used to tell me you always had to go in one direction. Otherwise, you confuse your Budino. But as a pastry chef doing it for over 20 years, I have found that doesn't hold true. You can kind of mix it any which way you want to. As long as it doesn't settle on the bottom anywhere, as long as you don't have any parts that are kind of staying too close to the heat and not getting agitated and kept up in the mixture, then you're pretty safe.
We have someone wondering if you could substitute Luxardo cherries. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah. I get the syrup that they come in.
Yes, absolutely. Those two are very similar. The Luxardo cherries actually come from a part of Italy that's not Italy anymore. It's Croatia. But back in the day, it was part of Italy. And when there were wars happening in that part of Italy, what ended up happening was the inventor of those cherries went up to the Veneto region, up by Venice, and started growing them up there. And as a result, they became a Venetian product. But yes, they're very, very similar, and you can easily interchange them. No problem there.
What temperature are you, do you have your stove on there to mix that mixture?
So I have it at a medium temperature. I'm regulating my temperature pretty closely. If you have a gas range at home, make sure that the heat isn't going up the sides. It's staying underneath your pan. The other thing is I'm using a non-reactive saucepan. That means I don't have any exposed aluminum. So check your pan, make sure it's not that brushed aluminum or there's no exposed aluminum on the inside of your pan. The reason is the cream will have a reaction to the aluminum and it turns your Budino gray. And so nobody wants gray food. So make sure you're using either stainless steel or a nonstick pan, and that won't react with your product inside it.
Could you use an immersion blender to mix this?
You could. The problem with an immersion blender is that often it adds too much air. But you could if it's a lot of work stirring it. I always joke that's why French people are so skinny, is because they do all the work to make those wonderful desserts before they eat it. They burn all those calories off before they consume it. So you would just keep stirring and stirring and stirring and stirring until this product becomes solid. Think pudding consistency, because that's what you're going for. You will be stirring it forever and think this is never going to come together. My arm is going to fall off first. And then all of a sudden it's going to come together very quickly for you. Then you're going to take the whole thing and you're going to put it in an ice bath. In my bowl here, I have ice and water, and I'm going to keep stirring this until it's room temperature. If I don't, the residual heat from my product is going to curdle on me because it's not being agitated. So you're going to want to keep stirring, keep stirring, keep stirring. What I like to do when I'm making this, I love having an audiobook on. See how I'm like tying that into the library? So you can have a wonderful audiobook on to listen to. That way you don't mind sitting here and stirring because your mind is off somewhere.
We appreciate that, Stephanie.
You're welcome. I really do love audiobooks, and the library has a great way to borrow them without cost, which is wonderful. So you're going to let this cool down. Once it's cooled down, you can then use an ice cream scoop or any kind of a spoon, however you want to, and you can then put it into any kind of fancy container you like. So here I have just like a little dessert glass, and I'll bring that closer to show you. Or depending what your drink of choice is at home, this is a martini glass. This is a wine glass. And then what I like to do is finish it off by taking those Amarena cherries that I mentioned. Remember, we put the syrup into our pudding or our Budino. And then what I like to do is add a few right there on top. And you can even drizzle a little syrup up there. But it makes a really nice sort of family-friendly treat, but with a little bit of sophistication to it as well.
Have you ever made this with white chocolate? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely possible. Instead of using the bittersweet when you make your cream or your custard, just mix in white chocolate. In this recipe, you don't have to change anything to it. The white chocolate will melt and will work just as beautifully as the dark chocolate will.
Awesome. Okay, you want me to fire off some questions here?
Yeah, I'm happy to have some.
Okay, so first, what is on the top of your pudding there?
So what we did to finish it off is a little bit of pastry cream, or not pastry cream, sorry, it's something called chantilly cream, which is just a sweetened whipped cream. So it's really just a sweetened whipped cream. It's heavy whipping cream whipped with powdered sugar and a little vanilla. But, you know, as long as you don't tell my mother that stuff in a can, the aerosol stuff, the real whipped cream, you can use that as well. And then I just took some chocolate and like a chocolate bar and a carrot peeler, and I peeled the little flakes from that chocolate bar to make these very simple, kind of user-friendly chocolate curls.
That looks amazing.
Yeah.
Is this something that can be made in advance, like the night before?
Absolutely. This is something you can absolutely make the night before. What I would recommend doing is maybe not topping it with the whipped cream or the cherries. Just make the pudding. Make sure the top of it is covered with plastic wrap so it doesn't get a skin in the refrigerator. But you can make this up to 2 days ahead of time. And then just put the whipped cream and chocolate shavings as you're ready to serve it out to family or friends.
Perfect. And I think I have all the questions answered about the pudding, but there are still a few biscotti questions that we have.
Sure, I'm happy to answer them.
Perfect. So for the biscotti, if you would add dried cherries, would you chop them before adding them in?
I would not, because I like big chunks of things. So I would put the big cherries in there whole. And then as I'm slicing my biscotti, I'm going to end up cutting them into the different slices. So why put that extra work on yourself? Get those nice big chunks in there, and then they'll slice up with your biscotti.
All right. And then also for the biscotti, could you substitute white sugar with something like coconut sugar?
The problem with coconut sugar is that it's not sucrose, so it doesn't behave the same way in your recipe as granulated sugar does. If it's something that you're interested in doing to make this recipe lower sugar, you'd have to experiment with the coconut sugar to see that the texture turns out the same. I'd hesitate to use it as a one-for-one substitute without testing that first, because I don't know how the coconut sugar would behave, because sugar does more than just sweeten a recipe. It's hygroscopic, so it brings in moisture. It disrupts the gluten structure, so it helps to keep the product soft. And it does a lot more than just sweeten. So I'd want to see how coconut sugar behaves in that recipe. And unfortunately, I haven't done a lot of experimentation with coconut sugar to give you a definitive answer on that.
Okay, another question here. Should you cool the biscotti on a cooling rack or on the sheet? Does that matter?
It depends on how long you've baked it in the oven. Your sheet tray works fine as long as the bottom isn't too brown. If you've really browned the bottom and you think, ooh, this is going to be inedible if it cooks any longer, then you're going to want to take the whole parchment paper and just put it onto the countertop. The reason is your pan is going to stay hot and it's going to continue to cook the bottom of your cookie while it's cooling down on that counter. So if you've overcooked the bottom or you're close to overcooking it, then remove it from the cookie sheet. If not, you can let it ride on that cookie sheet to cool down.
That's great advice.
Thanks.
Another flour question. Could you use pastry flour?
No. Pastry flour doesn't work in this recipe because pastry flour has not enough gluten content in it. So when we talk about the content of gluten in flours, bread flour has the highest percentage of gluten protein. AP flour is next down the line. And then you've got pastry flour and then cake flour. Pastry flour just doesn't have enough gluten in it to really work in this biscotti recipe. So I would definitely not substitute it.
Whenever you started and you were mixing the sugar and egg, is there a certain consistency that you wanted that to get to before you added your next ingredients?
I had it volumized. So what happened is as I was mixing my sugar and my egg, the sugar is creating these little micro tears in my egg mixture, and it's allowing air to get in there. So it's going to lighten in color and it's going to volumize or come up a little bit. So I didn't quite take it to like a ribbon stage, but after 2 or 3 minutes, it's going to be sort of baby chick yellow, and it's going to be at least 1.5 times its volume from when you started.
Okay, this question says, I'm allergic to oranges and orange juice. What could I substitute?
So you can use all lemon in that recipe. You can skip the zest altogether. And as far as rehydrating that fruit, you don't have to use juice. I used juice tonight just because I thought it would be a nice flavor profile, but I at home often will raid my liquor cabinet and use amaretto or any kind of sort of nice tasting liquor. I've done brandy cherries, so put the cherries in brandy and then mixed those into the biscotti. Again, the alcohol, most of it will burn off, not all of it, but most of it will burn off in the baking process, but you'll still get that wonderful flavor of that liqueur. So you don't have to use the juice, especially if you're allergic to it. You can easily sub out a liqueur.
All right, now some Budino questions. What is the difference from the Budino and chocolate mousse?
The difference between Budino and chocolate mousse is where the whipped cream goes. So in a mousse, you're basically making the same thing, sort of a very rich chocolate base, but then you're folding whipped cream into it. And a lot of times mousse will whip egg whites and then also fold the egg whites into that recipe. In a Budino, there are no egg whites. We don't want egg whites anywhere near us. It's just the yolks. And we're not adding any whipped cream and volumizing or lightening that pudding, basically, that chocolate pastry cream, that Budino. It's rich, it's dense, it's very, very thick. When you add whipped cream or whipped egg whites to a mousse, you're volumizing it or lightening it and giving it a very light mouthfeel. So the difference is the extra ingredients you add to it to make it a mousse.
All right, also for the Budino, can you omit the cherry syrup? And in the recipe, it mentions vanilla bean paste. Where can you buy that?
So vanilla bean paste is one of the loves of my life. Vanilla bean paste, I adore it so much that my husband gave it to me for Christmas a couple of years ago, and I was thrilled. That's all I wanted. But what it is when you take the vanilla bean, if you open it up and scrape the actual seeds out of the vanilla bean, and then they're sort of suspended in like a goo, like a sugar goo. That's vanilla bean paste. It's an extremely intense vanilla flavor. I love it very much, but it's very expensive. Right now, vanilla is at a premium. So he got me like a little, almost looked like a travel toothpaste tube. And at the time it was $35. So vanilla bean paste is a luxury baking item right now because of the vanilla production in the world. But you can find that really in any of your supermarkets, they sell it. If you're going to buy vanilla bean paste, and you're going to make that investment, make sure you get the good stuff. Make sure that the vanillas are from the Madagascar Bourbon Islands. Those are where the premier vanilla production comes from. So look for vanilla bean paste that has the beans originate from Madagascar bourbon. I've bought vanilla bean paste at Heinen's, and certainly you can get it online, but make sure it comes from the right source.
Awesome. So this last question here is a great way for us to wrap up. We're asking, do you offer fudge classes, and where can we get a listing of the individual classes that are offered through the school?
Oh, I love that question. So we do all different kinds of classes at the school, and sometimes we might do a candy workshop, which would include making fudge, because fudge certainly is chocolate, but there's a sugar syrup that gets incorporated into that. So it's often included in our candy making classes. But due to COVID, our class schedule changes regularly. We're often adding classes because we've reduced the number of people in our classes. They sell out very quickly. So here at the school, if you want to know where we might have classes coming up, we do about 7 to 10 a week. You can find them on our website, and it's lpscinc.com, the Loretta Paganini School of Cooking, Inc., and it's the letters, so lpscinc.com. Click on classes. You can sort by type of class if you want a demonstration or a hands-on. We have tons of children's classes, which are my favorite to teach, and you can even sort by instructor. So if you love me and want to take more of my classes, you can see which classes of mine are coming up soon.
Awesome, Stefanie. Thank you so much for your time tonight. This was a great demonstration. And everyone, I will go ahead and I will send the recipe, and I will send Stefanie's website along in an email after the program so that you can have all of that in one place. So again, thank you so much, Stefanie, and thank you everyone for attending.